All right, everybody, welcome to the last two lectures of the semester. We're going to move on from the High Middle Ages finally and into a bit more of a description of the Renaissance. This is just going to be kind of a general review of the Renaissance that is a good contextual backup to the reading that you're already doing, I hope, in the textbook in this chapter. But also, we're going to really finish up the semester with something that happens as a result, or at least partially as a result of the Renaissance, which is the religious Reformation in Europe. The Renaissance, of course, we're talking about a very Western European event. And that is going to have implications around the world at some point when it comes to exploration and conquest that is driven by some of what the Renaissance brings in. And what that brings in, or the requirements of it, are expansion of markets. So we'll talk a little bit today about the expansion of markets in Europe. If you have more people that want to make things and buy things, new kinds of luxuries and technologies, then you have to be able to go and find resources to make those things, mineral goods, for instance, or lumber, or whatever it is that you need to actually create products for your new industries. And then you need people to sell those to. And sometimes you sell those products to your own people, but then you might have more stock. And that means that you need to sell that stock, which means you need to find other people. And hence, you've got maritime exploration to both find resources around the world to mine or harvest for your country to use to create new things, and also new markets or new peoples to sell stuff to. And that's the beginning of globalization, global markets. And that really starts with a very small, slow, steady increase in market economies in very specific parts of Europe, and then expands across the rest of Europe between. It takes longer in some places, but between roughly 1350 going into about 1750, depending on where you are in Europe. So, where does the Renaissance begin? Where is it already around by the time we get to the 1300s? It's basically right here where Italy is. You've got the Venetian Republic, which you notice is not just the city of Venice, it's the Venetian Republic, and we've mentioned this before. And then you've got the Kingdom of Naples. You notice there is no Italy here, it's just a bunch of big kingdoms run by very powerful families. Whenever you see Shakespearean plays that take place or are set in Italy, never are they talking about the Italians. They're always talking about specific families who are usually fighting other families or that sort of thing, right? That's the world that we're talking about here. So there are three main cities or republics, if you will, kingdoms that are where the Renaissance begins. So Venice, Florence, and Genoa. And Genoa is right up in here. So Venice, Florence, and Genoa. The thing about Venice, Florence, and Genoa, I'll show you another map of those again, is that all three of them were production centers that had large markets to sell to. It wasn't that Venice and Florence and Genoa were selling products to themselves, making things for themselves, and they were all unique and beautiful just for their own people. It's just that the resources that all three countries, or states, if you will, needed to make the products that they made came from other parts of Europe and other parts of Eurasia. So, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, which is the evolution of the Abbasid Empire that we talked about a couple lectures ago, the most recent Muslim empire called the Ottoman Empire, this empire provides a lot of the resources needed by the Italians, or specifically the Venetians, the people of Florence, and the people of Genoa, to create the things that they need to make. For instance, right here, Montenegro is actually a state that was founded by the Medicis. And the Medicis used this territory, it was kind of leased from the Ottoman Empire. It was used to harvest a material called alum. And alum is used in a number of processes that includes dyeing of cloth, and that the very beautiful dyes is something that the some of the Italian city states were kind of famous for, including the Medicis. And to get those beautifully colored, for instance, wools, you had to get that alum, and that alum came from over here. Well, the rest of Europe is kind of cut off. These guys are all cut off from trade with the Ottoman Empire for a lot of reasons. The confusion that resulted from the fall of the Roman Empire so long before, the fighting of different states against each other that's pretty constant, like the Hundred Years' War between England and France, going on crusades, all these different things, political fights, economic problems, the bubonic plague, all this stuff over the course of a few hundred years basically keeps these guys here out of this specialized trade and manufacturing that these guys here in Italy have access to and never lost. So even as the Roman Empire fell back before 500 Common Era CE, the Venetians, the Genoans, and the people of Florence were still trading, as were a lot of these other folks, were still trading in the Mediterranean Sea, and they still had access to the Silk Road, and they were dealing with the Ottomans despite the religious problems between the Christians and the Muslims of this period. And that meant that if you're in these three major city states, you had materials, raw goods, coming in from places like the Ottoman Empire. And you also had people to sell to, not just your own people, like your specially dyed cloth or whatever, but you also had people of the Ottoman Empire to sell your products to. So there's a nice little internal economy going on between the kingdoms of Italy and the Ottomans. And then, of course, in Western Europe, if you were rich enough, you could buy really good quality products like, again, beautifully dyed cloth or whatever, crossbowmen from Genoa, for instance, beautiful pottery and paintings from the artisans of Florence, right? You could do this by purchasing this kind of thing from the Italians, and the Italians are the only guys producing these kinds of beautiful, more complicated works of art and products to buy. So you had to be really rich basically up here to buy stuff from these guys. And then these guys, of course, are in the middle of the manufacture. Well, eventually it's going to expand. Eventually, other parts of Europe are going to expand into their own copies of the Italian Renaissance. And you're going to see Geneva, you're going to see Augsburg, you're going to see Mainz up here, Prague, Flanders. They're all part of the Renaissance eventually. Paris, London, and Madrid, excuse me, are all going to be part of the Renaissance eventually, but only as resources and trade expand from Venice, Genoa, and Florence into these regions where markets and products like raw goods could come from those regions, and that trade happens. So you'll notice that all these cities are all on rivers or next to coastlines, and that's because ships from the Italian city states carrying goods could then sail up and into places in the Spanish Peninsula or in France or up towards London or down into Flanders and all the way down here into Augsburg, right? These rivers are what provides access for Italian ships carrying trade from all over Eurasia, the Silk Road. And these guys are the gateway for that right in the middle of Western Europe is just the opening of trade. So the Renaissance starts in the 1300s in the Italian city states, and then it expands over the next few hundred years in other parts of Europe to sum up what I was just talking about. So the Renaissance, there's all this beautiful art. What does Renaissance mean? It just means rebirth. Basically, the idea of this, which I don't entirely agree with at all, is that the Renaissance is a time where the dark ages of Europe slowly but surely expand into a golden age of art and literature and new glory of civilization. I think that's a very self-gratuitous way to talk about modern Europe as opposed to, say, older Europe. I think you can find plenty. In fact, I know you can find plenty of beautiful art and beautiful literature and amazing works of people and artisans from before the Renaissance in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, it's just that we either didn't hear about them as much because the communication had broken down, or we don't know much about them, or it's just that people in the Renaissance and after decided to forget about all that and say, look how cool we are. We're so much better than those people from the past. Well, I think that just says a lot about what we what people decided to forget about the Middle Ages, and was loaded with all kinds of amazing works of art and whatnot. And for sure, it is a revival of Greek and Roman interest, right? In influence stuff. So that's absolutely true. So the most wealthy city states that were also city states that traded with the rest of the Ottoman Empire. And that's why they were the most powerful, and ushered in all that money that could be turned into works of art and whatnot that created the Renaissance: Genoa, Venice, and Florence. So you can see them on this map now pretty clearly. Genoa was famous again for providing crossbow men and mercenaries to go fight in Europe's armies. Whenever the French went up against the English, the French almost always had crossbows, which they hated. The French were really big on having knights on horseback charging at the enemy in full armor. That was something that the French loved, the spirit of nobility. And well, the problem is that if the English have longbows that can shoot from 300 yards away, then you also need to have artillery. So you have to bring in somebody that can shoot some kind of missile weapon. And the French didn't produce their own, so they had to hire people from Genoa to come to join their army and fight against their enemies. Venice, which is a maritime trading center. Florence, which is also a maritime trading center, but it has different kinds of trade than what Venice does. All right. So basically, these three city states are very powerful, and they usher in the Renaissance because they have money and capital for which to actually continue. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, many hundreds of years before, these guys continue to trade with either parts of Europe or parts of the Muslim Empire, which had taken over so much territory. These guys are still trading. They're still sending ships out and buying and selling, and that allowed them to basically survive as powerful states on their own, despite whatever was going on in the rest of Europe. There's a Medici right there. And they're famous for dominating banking in Europe. But they use their money to produce great arts as well, to pay for and influence arts, which means that the Medicis are known as ruthless merchants, bankers, and traders, but they're also known as patrons of art. I guess if you are a player of that one version, I think number 3, the expansion of Assassin's Creed, you know all about these guys because all that history is kind of thrown in there. So lots of, these kind of warehouses full of people doing Greco-Roman style art that was going to be the artistic herald of the Renaissance period. And there are 3 terms to know when it comes to the Renaissance: humanism, individualism, and secularism. Okay. Before the Renaissance, in the major cities that are involved in the Renaissance, the real focus is on religion and kind of a larger view of your role in the state. All right, the feudal system and what you're contributing to that feudal system. Well, this is interesting because as we get into the Renaissance, you've got people who are beginning to study humans and human everything. When we come down to say human psychology and human physiology and human culture, for instance, right? Individualism, which has to do with the person and what their contribution can be based on their own participation in something, meaning it's not just about you are Bill, who is of the state and therefore you serve the state. It is you are Bill and you have these skills and we should recognize you for those skills. Bill, well done, Bill. Good job, Bill. Right? It's not just to my king and to God goes all the glory. With individualism, you might say that to my king and my God goes all the glory, but also I'm cool too, and look what I made. Right? So there's more of a study of the individual here. I'm making this real basic. And secularism, basically, what happens if you take religion out of something? What do you get? Right? Meaning people in the Renaissance, especially in the big cities, are going to be focusing on, say, arts and sciences that do not necessarily always have to be linked with something religious. Remember, the biggest power that emerges over all of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire is really the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church between 500 and, say, 1000 is going to increase its power to really being a religious empire of its own. And if you wanted to become a king, you had to be crowned by somebody in the church. If you wanted to be able to be seen as a good and glorious monarch of your people, for people to follow you, the church had to agree that you deserved that right, that you had the divine right to rule from God, which could only be granted through the church. So the church was really not only a network that held people together after the fall of the Roman Empire, but it was also an overarching theme, the concept of religion that governed every single thing a person did. So as we get into the Renaissance, we get people who study humanism, individualism, and anything dealing with maybe non-church philosophy. And I don't want to say that the church was always at odds with it. There were humanists who were also Catholics, and individualists who were Catholics, and secular studiers of science who were also Catholics. Darwin was a Catholic priest. Let's just keep that real clear. All right. It's not that the church had no role and was not always present. It's just that there is an attempt here in powerful families of the Renaissance who could kind of do this because of their power, these trading families like the Medicis, to basically influence a different form of thought that eventually will start to question the church's role in society. The church is not wrong to be afraid of this, right? Because it's going to change their power base eventually, not right away, but eventually. So that's when we get to the Reformation. So these are just some forms of art, right? These are actually religious scenes that are turned into a very secularist form of Renaissance art. So you see all this, and although people of the time would recognize the different themes in here, this is really highlighting the different kind of painting styles you see in the Renaissance, and it's also highlighting the environment. A lot of Renaissance paintings, for instance, happen with these beautiful kind of background, almost romantic environments behind them as part of their story. Very different from the stylized paintings of the Middle Ages. The humanists stress the capabilities of human reason and individual accomplishment. So basically, studying the Greek classics, which were the last guys to really study human behavior, so Plato and Socrates and others, to understand the human condition and then apply that to people of modern Europe. So here is an example, for instance, and if you happen to go, if you live in California, you can go to the Getty Museum, and on the fourth floor of their medieval wing, they actually have an amazing array of illuminated manuscripts and medieval art there. Well, medieval art looks a lot like this. It's almost always based on some kind of religious study, and there's going to be this sort of, it's beautiful, I think, but it's also fairly stylized. It doesn't look like a photograph that's been turned into a painting. It looks very stylized and very flat, very two-dimensional. Compare that to this, and you can see the differences in the art form. The focus here is not on the people, not on the individual. The focus is on a religious event happenings. So when we get to the Renaissance, we're actually looking at a lot of focuses on secular, meaning non-religiously influenced, and also some religiously influenced ideas. Whereas the in the Middle Ages, often the art was specifically about religious concepts, right? Promoting that sort of story. Well, this is a great Renaissance era painting, and it's a painting of a city on any given day in the main square. And in there, if you look at it closely, you see people horsing around. You see people playing games. That's right, the biggest game of the age, the hoop and stick. That's right, a hoop and a stick. If you don't have a new Xbox or PlayStation, you could always pull out a hoop and a stick, you guys. But this is not a medieval scene. You would never see a medieval scene of people screwing around and having a good time, and it's basically during a festival. So, they're all just, it's really comical, right? There is nothing religious about this scene whatsoever, which would make it a very non-medieval, but definitely very pro-Renaissance sort of thing. People, what are people like? Oh my gosh, look at these people. Aren't they funny? Of course, the main artists of the period that we always hear about, there were plenty more. Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, all very unique people with what they could do. From like this guy, famous for painting and was hired out by many powerful people to paint them or paint scenes for them, but also famous for inventions. He was big on inventing new types of machines and ideas. Raphael, mostly a painter, but also did some sculpture. And Michelangelo, really famous for paintings and sculpture both. Just a lot of their work still survives, which is why we could talk about them. Leonardo da Vinci, this is, by the way, Leonardo da Vinci, one of his most famous works, of course, is the Mona Lisa. And the Mona Lisa is very unique from, say, the earlier period, the High Middle Ages and before, because it is not at all a stylized piece. There's nothing religious in this painting whatsoever. And it's a focus on this woman. And you don't have to know who she really is, and you don't really have to know where she is because there's a standard background that Renaissance artists put in everything, which has nothing to do with the actual subject. It just looks pretty, it's just wallpaper. And then you've got the subject right here. And you see that this is a woman. She actually does have quite a fascinating story, but you see this woman, and she's got a little bit of a smile on her face, and she's looking a little bit off to the side. And it looks almost like you could be in a room with her. Maybe you're doing something and she's doing something. You're not talking, but she's just kind of looking off into the background, and she's just kind of there. And when you look at her compared to other art of the time and even before, you never saw something quite so alive in a painting the way that this is. And you'll hear more about this in an art history class if you decide to take one, but it's just really a gorgeous painting. What's funny about this is how big it is. It's actually quite tiny. It's barely bigger than a shoebox, this thing. All right. It's really small. So if you ever do go to see a copy of it or the real one, like say you make it to the Louvre, you'll be about 100 feet back trying to look at this thing, and it'll be just like a little thumbnail way out there on the wall. It'll take hours to get up to the front to actually see it. That's just the way it is, because everyone wants to see it. It's famous. It's in all these books. You want to see the Mona Lisa, but there it is. Right here on the screen is probably the biggest you'll ever see it in your life, unless you could get to the front of that line at the Louvre. But there it is. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is famous for lots of other stuff. He was quite an inventor and created a lot of very interesting ideas and inventions that pushed forth the scientific efforts of his period. It's just neat stuff, including ideas for flight. It's just a really cool guy, but this is the one thing that people always seem to associate with him, this painting. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, did do religious subjects. Nothing religious about her. The whole painting is just a woman standing against a wall, looking past you, looking very pretty. That's all this is. Individualism and humanism. All right, that's what this is. When we look here, this is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci being hired by the church to do something, because the church is going to have some trouble, guys. During this period, the famous families, the big families that were purchasing art like this, meaning they were ordering the artists like Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci to create beautiful artworks. And then those artworks would be displayed in the mansions, manors, and castles of those very wealthy families. And what that means is that people would go to those beautiful displays of art. And those art, if you're displaying the art of these kinds of people, you're showing how wealthy you are, and you're really drawing away the focus of your society from the church to these big, powerful families, these nobles who were able to put this artwork up. Okay. And so what that means is that you've got folks that are making stuff like this and showing it, and people are going to look at it, but they're not spending their money and time going to the church as much. The church is becoming less interesting to people. There's other stuff to do now besides go to church, so to speak. And so from time to time, the church is going to hire these artists like Leonardo da Vinci to do something that they don't usually do, which is, instead of making Mona Lisa stuff or cool inventions, they're going to be asked to paint a very modern Renaissance-y version for the church to be hung up in the Vatican or wherever, of, say, the Last Supper or some scene like that. And it's considered to be a beautiful work of art as well. And the idea is that if the church can afford to get these Renaissance artists to make beautiful religious artworks, then people might go to the church to see these things, right? And then the church regains its relevancy again. I'll come back to this idea in a minute, because the idea of the church trying to figure out how to stay relevant during a time when people in big cities are starting to move away from seeing the church as being relevant is going to be a big part of what leads to the Reformation. We also have this done for the church. The church going, my God, we need to get more people into the church and we need to be relevant by having the works of Michelangelo here. Well, the Last Supper was one thing. We need more. Well, one of the other probably biggest financial moments where the church tries to put money into making itself relevant is going to be something called the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo is going to be hired to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And this is going to be a huge, huge event where this guy just paints all these religious stories all over the Sistine Chapel, doing it upside down, right? Or like lying on his back on a scaffolding and painting this. And it's absolutely remarkable. What's fun about this is that many of the older members, the boomers, if you will, of the church hated it. They couldn't stand this because it was so full of things that were against the European sentimentalities of the day. The idea of lots of naked people, very, again, Greco-Roman, the study of the human physique. Lots of naked people or scantily clad people all over the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican was obnoxious to a lot of the older people of the church. And of course, the younger people tended to find it being cutting edge, right? That's the old story. This one's fun. Cardinal Biagio da Cesena. It was disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures, exposing themselves so shamefully, and that it was no work for a papal chapel, but rather for the public baths and taverns. Right? This is a beautiful piece. The last judgment panel, it's just one panel of many, in the Sistine Chapel inside of the Vatican, and gorgeous, and people flock to it today to see it, and it's a huge deal. It's one of the artistic wonders of the world today, and you've got people of the time going, this belongs in a bar. That's fun. It's fun. It shows cultural change, right? This is one of my favorite, most interesting people of the period, Niccolo Machiavelli. He's an interesting fellow. Okay. He basically takes an early form of psychology and puts it into the concept of leadership. And what he's going to do is he's going to talk about how people can basically control their populations without having to worry about religion at all. He takes religion out of everything, takes the church out of everything, and talks about how you can basically be a very good dictator based on certain specific observations that Machiavelli has to make. Queen Elizabeth had a copy and referred to it quite a bit. Nixon had a copy. John F. Kennedy had a copy. Truman had a copy. FDR had a copy. This book has been around for a long time, and yet it remains the number one book on how to lead. If you wanted to take morality out of leadership and just talk about how you can basically encourage the masses to love you, even if you were doing terrible things. All right. So, although a number of political leaders loved this book by Machiavelli and followed it and still do, the church and people who believe in morality are going to hate this guy because basically what he's done is he's taken morality. A wise prince should not keep his promise when it is against his interest to do so. A wise prince should not keep his promise when it is against his interest to do so, and when his reasons for making the promise are no longer useful. If all men were good, this would be a bad guideline. But since they are evil and would not keep a promise to you, then you need not keep yours to them. Right? This is basically hardcore autocratic leadership styles. And if you're at all into the idea of the game of politics, you want to read his book. All right, market revolution stuff. We're going to spend just a few seconds on this and then end this lecture. Finally, thank God, right? Here are some things to know about. The Renaissance is both an artistic revival and a market revolution, meaning trade and resources. So a new middle class, we've already talked about this, of non-nobles called the bourgeoisie are going to be the ones that make a lot of money manufacturing projects and they're going to be managing the trade for the nobles. So a noble might say, "Hey, you there, Columbus, I need you to take a ship. I'm going to pay you here's some money. Take a ship and take my products like my beautiful blue dyed Medici wool and take it over to Paris for sale." Okay, cool, cool. And a guy like Columbus or any other mariner of his period would go, "Okay, cool," because that's what Columbus does. He sails ships around and navigates by the stars and the sun and everything like that, right? So Columbus is going to be hired to transport goods, and Columbus is going to make some money doing that, as are other people who handle that thing. The shipbuilders, the ship sailors, or the captains of those ships. I mean, the warehouses that store goods, the people that produce the products, the people doing the work of production and trade typically are not the nobles. The nobles are the ones that are ordering the work to be done and that want to buy the stuff that is made, but they don't want to actually be out there making it, right? And the nobles might even own the businesses, very much so. But again, they're not going to be the ones doing the actual work. So there's going to be this middle class of non nobles who are going to be doing the work and they're going to be doing the management. It's almost like the Industrial Revolution. You've got these robber barons who produce or who create factories, and then a lot of people from all different, you know, levels of economy work in those factories. You've got the management who is able to live in a nice house and afford good things. Who doesn't own anything, but not the factory, but they're your managers. And then there's your white collar workers, you know, who are handling all the paperwork and your banking. And then there's your blue class labor who is basically just doing the actual labor, right? They're the ones at the machines. And that's sort of what's going on here is you've got the nobles that basically own the property and often own the business, and then everybody else who can read and write, who's got a basic education, can basically manage the businesses for the nobles, and they're going to make a lot of money doing this. So the government makes money by creating and then taxing the industries and their trade. But the government's also very important in this process. This is the partnership. The government uses the money from the taxes not only to enrich itself, but also to build and send out navies and armies to secure the markets to bring in the resources for these new goods. So if you are part of this new middle class and you're managing the production of products, well, you still have to take those products somewhere to sell, and you also have to bring in the raw goods needed to actually produce those products. And that might mean that you have to go to sea and go to the colonies somewhere, or go to the Ottoman Empire, or even to Asia someplace, right? Well, how do you do that safely and not be worried about pirates and rogue states and enemies who are at war and all that stuff? Well, the only way to do that is for you to trust your government, who is going to use the money that you make from all this stuff, from all this trade, who is going to send out navies and protect your merchant ships and all that, right? So the government's going to provide the protection, but also the money to begin the industries in the first place. And this new bourgeoisie is going to be doing all the production and the actual trade. Rural peasants will become part of the cottage industry labor system. So these are your blue collar workers, and they're all in their towns, and they're basically doing the heavy labor and cottage industries, which means that in the city there's something that you're trying to make, but you need lots of little parts made. And so you actually send out to little towns around your city, to the farmlands, and say, "Hey, when you're not farming, would you like to help us make this stuff? Here's all the materials, make all these little things, send them back, and we will assemble them into products for sale." So this is where you don't have to bring in people to work in a factory. You actually send the work out to the people, and that's a form of a cottage industry. All right. So there are two forms of new business that's going to build up, new trade. Mercantilism, market trade with mostly government control and funding, where you have companies like, today, companies with wealthy people who all put their money into a venture where they're creating an industry and sending out ships to go trade, and they can defend themselves because the government's part of it. So the government can say, "Oh, your joint stock company is going to found a colony called Virginia, and you need a military to protect it, and you want to run the military. Okay, here's your contract. Raise your own soldiers, get your own ships, and defend the colony, and we will support that." right? So this is mercantilism, very government run private trade. Capitalism, which didn't exist yet, but the ideas for it are being laid during the Renaissance, is market trade where the government takes a back seat, where the government does what we call today laissez faire. All right. So in this case, the companies will invest their own capital, meaning their own money, to develop their own market and then make money. And the only way that the government gets money from this is they just have tax on trade, and that's it. Right. So it's private control of property. The thing is that with mercantilism, which comes out of the Renaissance, governments are not ready to take that back seat yet. They're not ready just to let companies do whatever they wanted. You don't see capitalism really become a thing until we look at, say, the American Revolution and that period of time where you have countries that are formed that break away from having direct government oversight. So capitalism is even more modern than mercantilism is. But these are two ideas that come out of the Renaissance with all this trade that's happening at the same time. Some empires that grow, and this really gets you into the next history course, History 185. So I'm going to end with this part because I need to transition to the Reformation for the last lecture of the semester. But I wanted just to show you that there's going to be some major trading empires that are as powerful as countries in their own right. The Dutch government actually allowed their citizens to form, under Dutch rule, to form two companies that would go out and send out explorers to settle new colonies. And then those colonies would produce the raw goods needed for these two companies to make their products. So there's going to be the Dutch West India Company, that's what this is, and the Dutch East India Company over in India is where they went. And the English will copy that model. And so English wealthy people under the English government are going to form the English East India Company and the English West India Company. Do you know where the Dutch and the English West India Company colonists went? That's right, North America for the most part. So New York is a territory that the Dutch will settle, and then of course places like the Puritans going to New England and the other English going down into Virginia, for instance, originally where Jamestown is. That's all the English West India Company being involved in that. So here is the Dutch East India Company, just to show you how far they spread. By the 17th century, so the 1600s, this is how far the Dutch have gone in this mercantilist system of trade. This is what they're doing, going from Amsterdam all the way around Africa and then going into Asia. And they have created a maritime trading network. And if you wanted to buy stuff from Asia and you live in Europe somewhere, you probably had to buy it through the Dutch East India Company at this point by the time we get to the 1600s. The same is true when you get to the English East India Company, and the English will be doing the same thing. So this is the symbol of the English East India Company. All right, the English one. And here they are, building ships all along the Thames River, just building ships because these ships are going to go out to sea and trade all around the world. All right, that's all part of bringing in new resources that your bourgeoisie can use to make products. All right, here's some images of the flags of the English private companies that got their charters from the government. The East India Company right here. I want you to come back up here. Do you notice that all these flags over here, these flags have something very similar with the American flag? Do you notice that? That's right, the red stripes. Okay, the symbol of the East India Trading Company. Okay, the red stripes, and then right here in the corner there is the British symbol. The very first flag, you guys, of the United States of America is this flag. This flag. All right. I know it sounds weird, but the very first flag of the United States of America is actually, oddly, the East India Company's flag. There's a long story as to why that is, but that's the flag that Americans were most used to because they were ultimately part of this larger trading network that made America wealthy with its trade. And then after a while, this symbol will be changed to, of course, your stars instead. I just thought I'd bring that up because I thought it was very interesting. Um, if if we looked at the Dutch East India Company, just to show you the wealth here, today in 2020, this is where Apple would be, right? And Apple's this huge, very powerful company. I don't know where Amazon would be, probably like in here somewhere, right? But here's the comparison. If you took the money of the 1600s and brought it up to 2020 value, then Apple would be right here and the Dutch East India Company would be right here. Okay, you can see just how crazy powerful these guys were when it came to global trade that was basically unregulated. But here they are, the Dutch East India Company, and these guys had their own military that they could use, just like the English version did, right? And this is the state of Virginia is also the first English colony with Jamestown, and here is their symbol, right? The Merchants of Virginia, right? Virginia was founded as a colony that was there to support the Renaissance era merchant system of trade. Here's a image of people in markets where there's products from all over the world are in these markets by the time we get to the late 1600s. Okay, I think that's pretty good for now. You'll get the rest of the details on this in the book, and then I'm going to record your Reformation lecture and get that up. And the Reformation lecture won't be quite as long as this one was. Thank you very much.